Hello, and welcome. Today, we delve into a dramatic and rapidly evolving geopolitical situation, the escalating tensions between Japan and China. This crisis has recently reached the highest level seen since the end of the Second World War, marked by unprecedented statements and military developments that are reshaping the strategic landscape of East Asia. The context of this current standoff is deeply rooted in history, but its immediate causes are strikingly modern and focused on the future of Taiwan. The current crisis began on the 7th of November 2025, when Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, made a truly breathtaking and unprecedented statement. She was asked, directly in the Japanese Diet, what would prompt Japan to exercise its policy of collective self-defense. Her public and pivotal answer was that if China were to initiate an armed blockade or invasion of Taiwan, it could constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan. This phrase is all important because it implied that Japan would trigger its right to collective self-defense, potentially deploying the self-defense forces into a war against China, even if Japanese territory itself had not been directly attacked first. It was the first time ever that a sitting Japanese prime minister had publicly suggested, during a formal session in parliament, that Japan might intervene militarily against China during a conflict over Taiwan. To understand the weight of this statement, one must grasp the constitutional context. Japan's constitution, drafted after the Second World War, explicitly states in Article 9 that the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. This constitution, following the horrors Japan experienced during the war, has meant the country remained a strictly pacifist nation for decades. Consequently, modern Japan's armed forces have always been referred to as self-defense forces, whose mission was restricted to the defense of Japanese territory in the event of a hostile foreign attack. However, in 2015, spearheaded by then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the Japanese government significantly reinterpreted Article 9 with a new security law. This law enables the self-defense forces to exercise collective self-defense, essentially granting Japan the legal authority to deploy military force abroad, if it is in the defense of an ally that has come under attack, and if it is judged necessary for the Japanese state's own survival. Sanae Takaichi's statement thus applied this reinterpretation to the specific scenario of a Taiwan conflict. China's response to the Prime Minister's remarks has been a mixture of shock and utter fury. The very next day, a Chinese consul general in Osaka responded with particular anger in a social media post, which was later deleted, but further diplomatic attacks from Beijing have followed. The Chinese government has consistently demanded that Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi retract her statement, a demand she has consistently refused. Beijing's actions have gone beyond rhetoric. They provocatively flew a drone between Taiwan and the southernmost Japanese island of Yonaguni, which led to the Japan Air Self-Defense Forces scrambling fighter jets. Even more provocatively, 4 Chinese Coast Guard vessels were sent into the territorial waters around the disputed Senkaku Islands, a small group of uninhabited islands administered by Japan, but claimed by China. China has also issued advisories warning against Chinese students studying in Japan or tourists visiting, which the Japanese government has estimated could cause over $14 billion worth of economic damage. Furthermore, China has banned the importation of all seafood from Japan and has recently begun blocking Japanese firms and culture from the country. This cultural ban was dramatically embodied by a viral event on November 29 when a Japanese singer performing a well-known theme song for the anime One Piece in Shanghai was forced off the stage by Chinese officials mid-performance. Compounding the diplomatic and economic pressure is Japan's enormous shift in its military posture. Japan is not only reinterpreting its legal rights to military engagement, but it is also backing its words with enormous new funding and arms for the self-defense forces. Frightened by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's increasing hostility toward Taiwan, Japan announced in 2022 that it would double its annual military spending from 1% of the gross domestic product to 2% by 2027. This equals the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's military spending targets for the first time in Japanese history. Shortly after becoming prime minister in late 2025, Sanae Takaichi announced that this timeline would be sped up by a year, reaching 2% of gross domestic product on military spending by 2026. This means that next year, Japan will likely achieve a defense budget of around $80 billion a year, placing it in the same league as the United Kingdom and near the top 5 highest military spenders on the planet. This is a truly titanic shift for a country so well known for its commitment to pacifism that not a single soldier in the self-defense forces has ever been killed in action by an enemy since the end of the Second World War. This rapid remilitarization is triggering deep and painful historical memories in China. The history between Japan and China is long, complicated, and contentious. As the two most preeminent powers in East Asia, they have maintained relations for thousands of years. However, in the late 19th century, Japan's rapid industrialization and political unity allowed it to take advantage of a historically weak and vulnerable, pre-industrial, and politically fragmented China. Japan contributed the most to China's so-called century of humiliation, inflicting more than 50 years of continuous pain and suffering. This began with the First Sino-Japanese War between 1894 and 1895, in which Japan's decisive victory removed Korea from the Chinese sphere of influence and forced China to cede Taiwan to Japan, where it remained a Japanese colony for the next half-century. Later, in 1900, Japanese troops participated in the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths. Following the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the Japanese issued the secret 21 demands to China, which essentially demanded that the whole of China subordinate itself into becoming a Japanese protectorate. This only failed after China published the extreme demands, sparking outrage from the British and Americans who pressured Japan to back down. The aggression escalated in 1931, when the Imperial Japanese Army staged the false flag Mukden incident, using it as a pretext to invade and conquer Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932. A vast settler colonial project was encouraged by the Japanese government in Manchuria to alter the region's demographics, leading to over 1 million Japanese settlers migrating into the territory by 1945. Small clashes continued until 1937, when Japan launched a full-scale invasion across the rest of China with the goal of outright conquest. The ensuing Second Sino-Japanese War, which lasted 8 years and spilled over into the Second World War, became one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, resulting in the deaths of around 20 million people, the vast majority of whom were Chinese civilians. Throughout the war, Japanese forces perpetrated an almost endless list of war crimes and atrocities. The two most infamous examples, which continue to strain relations today, are the Nanjing Massacre and Unit 731. After Japanese forces took control of Nanjing, then the capital city, near the end of 1937, they engaged in a brutal 6-week rampage of mass murder, looting, arson, torture, and abuse against the city's Chinese inhabitants. Newer estimates suggest up to 200,000 Chinese people were killed during this 6-week massacre, a rate of killing comparable to the Rwanda genocide in the 1,990 seconds. Meanwhile, Unit 731 was a top-secret research facility operated by the Imperial Japanese Army in occupied Manchuria throughout the war, conducting large-scale research into chemical and biological weapons, including brutal and lethal experiments on live human beings, usually abducted Chinese civilians. Victims of Unit 731 were subjected to deliberate deadly disease infections, chemical weapons and explosives, testing, live limb amputations, and live vivisections performed without anesthesia to avoid interfering with results. Other brutal experiments included organ harvesting, cold exposure and hypothermia testing, and hypobaric chamber testing, collectively believed to have killed around 14,000 victims. Not a single person who entered Unit 731 is known to have survived. Furthermore, the biological weapons developed led directly to the deaths of at least another 200,000 people across Chinese villages and cities through the Japanese Army's deliberate contamination of water supplies and agricultural lands. The legacy of these atrocities in Japan's 50-year war on China continues to negatively impact relations and frames the historical context in which China often views Japan's modern military expansion. At the end of the Second World War, Japan was thoroughly defeated and occupied by the United States. It was made to surrender all its conquered territories, including Taiwan, back to China and adopt its new pacifist constitution, which renounced its right to war and the use of force forever, effectively resulting in Japan's demilitarization. Traumatized by the war and the atomic bombings, the Japanese public also transitioned towards pacifism. Without the legal right to wage war, Japan agreed to be incorporated into the American security umbrella through the 1950 Security Treaty. This treaty guarantees that the United States will defend Japanese territory in the event of a hostile attack, in exchange for Japan granting the United States the right to base large numbers of military forces within the country. This arrangement was mutually beneficial. Japan outsourced its defense needs to America, allowing it to concentrate fully on rebuilding and developing its economy. Meanwhile, it enabled America to control a huge and strategically valuable rear base of military operations in East Asia, which it has used during wars in Korea and Vietnam and in buttressing the position of Taiwan against China. Despite Japan's new commitment to pacifism, relations with China remained tense. Japan continued recognizing the Republic of China's government on Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War in 1949, and did not normalize relations with the People's Republic of China until 1972. After the Korean War broke out in 1950, the United States encouraged Japan to establish an armed police force that evolved into the self-defense forces by 1954. For decades, the growth of the self-defense forces was kept at a minimum, organized to be the bare minimum force necessary to defend the Japanese home islands and resisting the acquisition of offensive capabilities. By the late 1972, an informal cap on the self-defense forces budget of 1% of gross domestic product had come into effect, lasting until the 2020 seconds. However, starting the 2010 seconds, Japan's geopolitical situation began growing increasingly precarious due to four major developing reasons. The first reason has been an increasingly bold and aggressive North Korea on Japan's doorstep, now armed with nuclear weapons. North Korea conducted its first successful nuclear weapons test in 2006 and has since conducted 6 more. The most recent test reached an explosive power threshold of 160 kilotons, 10 times the power of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimates that as of January 2025, North Korea possesses around 50 active nuclear weapons and has enough fissile material to produce another 40. North Korea has also likely acquired the capability to mount one of these nuclear weapons to ballistic missiles that can impact and destroy any city in the Japanese home islands, posing an existential threat to Japan for the first time. They are also known to possess about 1,000 ballistic missiles, hundreds of which have the range and capability to impact targets in Japan with conventional warheads. Multiple North Korean missile tests have flown directly over Japanese territory, further putting Japan on edge. Even more concerning is North Korea's growing military closeness to Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. North Korea is the only United Nations member state, other than Russia itself, to have formally recognized Russia's conquests and annexations in eastern Ukraine. North Korea has supplied Russia with millions of artillery shells and has even deployed thousands of its own soldiers to fight against the Ukrainians during the Kursk offensive in 2024. Recent intelligence also suggests North Korean troops are active in the Russian-occupied parts of the Zaporizhia region of Ukraine, potentially making North Korea an active belligerent in the invasion. North Korea and Russia have signed a renewed military alliance, pledging mutual defense, and the Russians are known to be providing the North Koreans with advanced military technologies in exchange for the support in Ukraine. This means the North Korean army is growing more capable and dangerous, with increasing military technology and real-world modern battlefield experience, while its nuclear arsenal continues to pose an existential threat to Japan. The second, and arguably the most important, reason is an increasingly powerful and assertive China. Between 2013 and 2022, while United States military spending increased by only 2.7%, Chinese military spending skyrocketed by over 63%. As of 2024, the United States still maintains the highest military spending in the world at $997 billion a year, compared to China's $314 billion a year. However, while America's military is engaged globally, China's military is only engaged regionally in East Asia. Starting in 2010, as China's ambitions grew with its power, it began increasingly clashing with Japan over territorial disputes that had been dormant for decades. Between 2010 and 2012, the two countries clashed bitterly over the status of the Senkaku Islands, which Japan controls but China claims and calls the Diaoyu Islands. The 2012 Japanese government purchase of 3 of these disputed islands from their private owner triggered huge anti-Japanese protests in China. China attempted to pressure Japan by temporarily restricting the export of rare earth minerals, the first time it seriously weaponized its trade relationship with Japan over a diplomatic dispute. Around the same time, China unilaterally issued an extended maritime exclusive economic zone claim in the East China Sea that significantly extended into Japan's claimed exclusive economic zone area, introducing a major maritime dispute that still remains. Then, in 2013, China unilaterally declared an extension of its air defense identification zone across the East China Sea, incorporating the Senkaku Islands and significantly overlapping with Japan's claimed air defense identification zone, further escalating the conflict. China's growing arsenal of missiles is a particular concern for the Japanese. As of 2024, the Pentagon estimates China possesses around 400 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 500 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, 1,300 medium-range ballistic missiles, 900 short-range ballistic missiles, and 400 ground-launched cruise missiles. This means China now possesses hundreds of missiles that can reach the Japanese home islands in the event of a conflict. China profoundly delivered this point in 2022, when then United States House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. After the visit, China initiated large-scale military exercises encircling Taiwan that included multiple ballistic missiles being fired directly into Japan's maritime exclusive economic zone just south of the Japanese island of Yonaguni. This clearly illustrated China's capability to strike Japanese territory or warships if it so desired. Both China and Japan understand that the status of Taiwan is a core national interest for both of them. For Japan, a Chinese takeover of Taiwan would be geopolitically disastrous. China would break the continuous link in the so-called First Island chain, the line of islands through Japan, the Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Indonesia that box in the Chinese coast and contain the Chinese Navy's ability to break out into the open Pacific. The countries along the First Island chain are staunch United States allies. With a successful Chinese takeover of Taiwan, the chain would be broken, and the Chinese Navy could finally access the greater Pacific unobstructed. Furthermore, from control of Taiwan, China could increase pressure on the Senkaku Islands dispute and their disputed maritime and airspace areas with Japan, which has serious implications for potential offshore natural gas reserves. Potentially worst of all, Japan's critical sea lines of communication would become more exposed to its historic rival. Japan is enormously over-dependent on maritime trade to survive. Nearly 90% of Japan's energy imports transit through vulnerable maritime choke points like the waters near Taiwan. If these sea lanes are compromised during a conflict over Taiwan, Japan only has a strategic liquefied natural gas reserve that holds just 19 days' worth of net liquefied natural gas imports, though it has 232 days' worth of net oil imports. If a war blockade over Taiwan lasts longer than 40 days and keeps the sea lanes compromised, Japan would face strategic paralysis and an economy that would begin grinding down without the necessary energy imports. Rerouting energy imports away from Taiwan would add both time and cost, and there is no guarantee that China wouldn't continue interfering to apply more pressure on Japan's economy later. These are the reasons why Japan has long maintained a policy of keeping the Indo-Pacific region both free and open. There is also a concern that no matter what Japan does, it may not be able to stay out of a Chinese invasion or blockade of Taiwan for long. The island of Yonaguni, the southwesternmost island of Japan, is merely 110 kilometers away from Taiwan. It is an extremely important location for both China and the United States to control during a potential conflict. Yonaguni and the rest of the Japanese islands in the Ryukyu chain, stretching up to Okinawa, would be vital for establishing aerial supremacy and logistics routes for United States forces, resupplying Taiwanese forces, or counterattacking Chinese positions. The islands are a major component of the United States fishhook, underwater sensor network, critical for detecting Chinese submarines, and the bulk of American military forces stationed in Japan are nearby in Okinawa, with some 30,000 United States troops permanently deployed. If the United States intervened during a Taiwan conflict, even if Japan itself did not, China would likely at least use its missiles to bombard American bases and assets in Okinawa. In extreme scenarios, China might even attempt amphibious operations to seize the southwesternmost Japanese islands between Yonaguni and Makushima to secure its northern flank against potential United States reinforcements and naval and air operations. Thus, Japan has major legitimate reasons to fear that its territory could come under attack or occupation, and its economy threatened by a Chinese assault on Taiwan. There is also the risk that military action by China in the Taiwan Strait, or by North Korea in the Korean Peninsula, could encourage escalation by the other within their respective theaters. China might encourage North Korea to ratchet up hostilities in the Korean Peninsula to distract and tie down United States and allied assets away from Taiwan. Even if not encouraged, a full-blown Chinese attack on Taiwan that draws in United States assets would inevitably present an opportunity for North Korea to take advantage of the distraction and increase escalation in Korea. The major fear for Japan and America is a worst-case two-front war in East Asia, with conflicts breaking out in the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula almost simultaneously. Even if this does not happen, the mere chance of North Korean escalation during a Taiwan conflict will force Japan and the United States to hold at least some resources in reserve, rather than focusing everything against China alone. A third reason why Japan is reconsidering the modern role of the self-defense forces is the wavering commitment of the Trump administration to defend United States allies, including Japan. Donald Trump has publicly suggested he would not send United States forces to protect North Atlantic Treaty Organization states in Europe, and has openly criticized the BSTC, long-standing United States Japan's Security Treaty. As recently as March 2025, Trump plainly stated that he felt the security treaty with Japan was unfair and a bad deal because it pledges the United States to come to Japan's defense, but does not pledge Japan to come to the United States' defense. Japanese officials were quick to point out that the treaty also enables the United States to station tens of thousands of its troops in Japan across dozens of bases, a burden Japan ultimately bears. This has led to fears in Japan that the United States might not be serious about assisting them during an emergency scenario around Taiwan. Knowing that the United States military is globally engaged, while the Chinese military is only regionally engaged in East Asia, Japan has felt pressure to increase its own military spending to help compensate or to hedge. The fourth and final reason for Japan's remilitarization was the precedent set by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, which clearly showed that massive wars of conquest, launched by one state against another, were not relics of the past. Only months after the invasion began, then, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida warned that Ukraine today may well be East Asia tomorrow. Polls showed that around 90% of the Japanese public believed their country needed to do more to prepare for a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Due to all these various threats, Japan has felt compelled to act, evolving from the reinterpretation of the Constitution's Article 9 inches 2015 to the 2022 announcement that they would double their defense spending to 2% of gross domestic product by 2027, an effort recently expedited to 2026. In February 2025, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces provocatively sailed a destroyer directly through the Taiwan Strait for the first time ever. This triggered a spokesperson with China's Ministry of National Defense to say that while China respects navigation rights, it firmly opposes any country creating trouble in the Taiwan Strait, infringing upon China's sovereignty and security, and sending wrong signals to Taiwan independent separatist forces. This incident occurred even before Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's recent remarks, suggesting a Chinese attack on Taiwan would trigger collective self-defense and lead to armed Japanese intervention. So, what exactly is Japan planning to acquire and do with its doubled defense budget? First, and probably most controversially, Japan plans to finally equip the self-defense forces with strike capabilities like long-range cruise missiles. Japan has declared its intent to purchase 400 United States-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, which can accurately strike targets up to 2,400 kilometers away. These can be equipped on Japan's naval assets, like destroyers and submarines, giving the maritime self-defense forces the ability to strike targets deep within the Chinese or North Korean interiors for the first time. This capability was long considered taboo for the self-defense forces. To navigate the optics of this acquisition, Japan uses the term counter-strike capability instead of strike capability, emphasizing that the missiles will not be used for preemptive strikes but only after Japan itself comes under attack first. In November 2025, a Japanese destroyer arrived in California to pick up the very first set of these Tomahawk missiles. Hundreds more are soon to follow, along with several hundred domestically produced long-range anti-ship missiles called the Type 12 missile, developed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which will have a range of about 1,000 kilometers. Japan has also been steadily increasing and improving its submarine fleet. In 2010, at the beginning of the modern confrontation with China, Japan possessed only 16 submarines. As of 2025, this has grown to 24. While all of Japan's submarines are conventionally powered by electric diesel engines, the newest generation, called the Taige class, introduced in March 2022, are extremely capable machines. Nicknamed Sea Ninjas, they are very quiet, excellent for reconnaissance, and capable of covertly deploying sea mines and launching torpedoes. They are also expected to be armed with the United States-supplied Tomahawk cruise missiles which will enable them to launch long-range precision counterstrikes deep within the Chinese interior if they choose. Currently, the Japanese submarine fleet consists of 5 of these modern Taige-class submarines and 15 older generation Soryu-class submarines. 2 more Taige-class submarines are expected to become operational by 2027. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces would likely deploy these 7 modern and quiet submarines to the southwesternmost Ryukyu Islands during a Taiwan conflict. Their mission would be to hunt and attack Chinese submarines, attempting to break through the first island chain, kill surface warships attempting amphibious assaults, and potentially fire counterstrike salvos of Tomahawks at military targets within China itself. Japan's older generation submarines and surface warships would be dedicated to keeping Japan's sea lines of communication and imports of oil and liquefied natural gas as open and secure as possible through escort missions with tankers. Japan has even inquired about potentially acquiring United States nuclear-powered submarines following recent American agreements to provide them to other allies in the Indo-Pacific region, like South Korea and Australia. Japan also intends to use its doubled defense spending to acquire no fewer than 147 F-35 fighter jets from the United States, which will make Japan the second largest operator of the F-35, only after the United States itself. The fighters will also be capable of being armed with long-range cruise missiles, which, like the submarines, will be capable of striking targets deep within the Chinese interior if necessary. 105 of the F-35 seconds on order will be conventional models, but notably, 42 will be the F-35B, short takeoff and vertical landing model. This is important because these are the F-35 seconds planned to be deployed to Japan's upgraded Izumo-class helicopter carriers. Japan possesses 2 of these small aircraft carriers, the Izumo and the Kaga, which were originally designed to carry helicopters. Now, Japan is retrofitting and upgrading both carriers to enable them to transport and launch up to 12 F-35Bs at a time. This will give Japan one of the strongest power projection capabilities in the world, and enable them to fight more effectively for aerial supremacy in hotspots like the East and South China Seas. When completed around 2027, the Izumo and the Kaga will be the first Japanese naval vessels to operate fixed-wing aircraft since the days of the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Second World War. Many of the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Type 12 missiles are planned to be stationed on the island of Kyushu by the spring of 2026. This will give Japan extensive missile coverage from the safety of the home islands across the entire Ryukyu island chain, extending across the southwest. Across the parts of the island chain from Okinawa to Yonaguni, the Japanese are planning even more preparations. The island of Yonaguni, closest to Taiwan, is growing increasingly militarized. The Japanese have already set up a surveillance radar facility on the island and deployed an electronic warfare unit there in 2024 to jam enemy communications and guidance systems around Taiwan's northern flank. In 2025, they confirmed they will shortly be deploying batteries of medium-range surface-to-air missiles to the island, presumably to guard against Chinese aircraft and drones. The island of Ishigaki, further east, is being armed with anti-ship missiles, while Makojima, even further east, is also being equipped with missiles and transformed into a hub for air surveillance and ammunition storage depots. These depots will be accessible by Japanese and American amphibious warfare units for counterattacks, presumably coming down the chain from the principal United States military bases on Okinawa. Beginning in November 2025, as the crisis between Japan and China continued to escalate, United States Marines were observed conducting exercises, moving supplies like fuel and ammunition from Okinawa to Yonaguni, presumably to simulate establishing a forward operating base there. The Japanese themselves have also begun training and creating a new amphibious rapid deployment brigade based on Kyushu. This brigade is modeled after the United States Marine Corps and tasked with the mission of recapturing islands in the Ryukyu chain that might fall under Chinese occupation in the event of a full-scale conflict. In the city of Oita on Kyushu, the Japanese are currently building 4 new large ammunition depots to house anti-ship and ground attack missiles, positioning still more assets nearby to the Ryukyu Islands in the event of a contingency. Japan is also expanding its abilities to evacuate its citizens. If the southwestern Ryukyu Islands become a war zone, Japan will have to consider evacuating tens of thousands of the island's Japanese residents to safety back on the main islands, a mission the Maritime Self-Defense Forces must be prepared to carry out. While not actively considered yet, there is always the possibility that Japan might eventually calculate that the time has arrived to acquire its own independent nuclear weapons arsenal to guarantee maximum deterrence. Japan possesses the technology, resources, and technical expertise to likely be able to build a functioning nuclear weapon in less than a single year. The only factors preventing this so far have been their own taboo against nuclear weapons, United States opposition, and the United States security guarantees that place them under the American nuclear umbrella. However, should those things change, especially the United States security guarantees, Japan would almost certainly acquire its own nuclear weapon rapidly to guarantee deterrence against its nuclear-armed adversaries in China and North Korea, and potentially Russia. Japan has seen the precedent of Ukraine, which surrendered its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances, only to face an invasion and war of conquest fewer than 30 years later. In the event of a Taiwan conflict, Japan could conceivably respond in one of 4 different ways, each with varying levels of escalation and risk. In one scenario, Japan might choose a strictly defensive stance, declining to trigger its security law for collective self-defense and focusing instead on surveillance, missile defense over the Ryukyu Islands, and evacuating its citizens. While this might keep Japan out of the conflict, it would inevitably cause great harm to Japan's relationship with the United States. Under a second scenario, Japan could take a slightly more aggressive approach and provide logistical support to American forces, allowing the United States to access fuel and ammunition depots, utilize Japanese bases for air and naval operations, and use its maritime self-defense forces to keep the sea lines of communication open. In this scenario, the self-defense forces would still try to avoid direct conflict, but China might see Japan as heavily assisting the American war effort, potentially exposing Japanese territory to retaliatory attacks and still dragging them into the war. Under a third and much more aggressive scenario, Japan could invoke its right to collective self-defense by declaring an assault on Taiwan a survival-threatening crisis, but still try to avoid direct combat around Taiwan itself. Instead, the Japanese self-defense forces could focus on safeguarding the Ryukyu Islands by intercepting Chinese aircraft, drones, missiles, submarines, and ships attempting to attack or break through them. Their warships could also escort American naval vessels through critical maritime choke points near Taiwan, like the Miyako Strait in the north and the Bashi Channel in the south. A final, fourth, and dramatically more aggressive option would be to fully commit the self-defense forces to heavy combat operations in and around Taiwan. This might involve firing their new long-range cruise missiles to strike military targets within China itself, which would make Japan a direct combatant and possibly incur the full wrath of China in retaliation. Regardless of the option Japan might choose, the country also faces significant domestic problems toward its remilitarization drive. For one thing, there are major issues concerning how exactly to pay for it. Japan already has one of the highest national debts in the world as a percentage of its gross domestic product, currently standing at about 237%, nearly double the debt ratio of the United States. Tacking on even more debt to pay for the military expansion is a difficult prospect, leaving the unpopular choice of increasing taxes. This is politically difficult since Japan already has very high tax rates due to its rapidly aging population and social welfare programs. Speaking of the aging population, Japan has a critical shortage of available manpower to fill its military ranks. The number of young men in Japan aged between 18 and 26, the prime age for military service, peaked more than 30 years ago in 1994 at around 17 million. By 2020, that number had shrunk to only 11 million and is projected to shrink further to beneath 8 million by 2050, fewer than half the numbers available in the 1,990 seconds. Low pay, tough work, low unemployment in the private sector, and the limited prestige of serving in the armed forces of a constitutionally pacifist nation have further discouraged recruitment among the shrinking pool of manpower. Consequently, the self-defense forces have missed their recruitment targets every single year since 2014. Moreover, the self-defense forces lack any credible or relevant real-world combat experience today. The last time a Japanese soldier is known to have been killed in action was back in 1972, and that was a fanatical holdout from the Second World War who died in a shootout with police in the Philippines decades after the war had already ended. The self-defense forces themselves have never once experienced a fatality in combat in their entire history. Whether they and the Japanese public at large are prepared for potentially enormous rates of casualties during a major hot war with China or North Korea is a significant hurdle to overcome. Neither Japan nor China is currently seeking war with each other. However, the legacy of their shared histories and their mutual military preparations in the present are increasingly making each other nervous, causing a cycle of increasingly hostile rhetoric and actions. Xi Jinping's China is determined to establish the authority of the Communist Party over Taiwan, which, in their eyes, will finally unify China and end the legacy of China's century of humiliation. If Japan intervenes, China will see it as nothing less than a historical showdown, interpreting it as a Japanese attempt to prevent the unification of their country. Meanwhile, the Japanese will interpret a Chinese attack on Taiwan as a dangerous act of aggression that will threaten their long-term stability and the lives of their citizens on the small Japanese islands nearby. Neither side wants war, but neither side will be willing to back down when the stakes are this high. In Japan's view, as the legendary Japanese samurai Miyamoto Musashi once said, "It is better to be a soldier in a garden than a gardener in a war." In some ways, though, Japan has been in a hostile confrontation with its neighbors in East Asia for longer than most people are probably aware of, especially when it comes to North Korea. Although North Korea has repeatedly fired missiles over Japanese territory since 2017, the North Koreans have also done much worse to the Japanese in earlier decades. Between 1977 and 1983, hundreds of Japanese people began mysteriously disappearing without a trace, usually along the country's coastlines. For decades, there were no clear explanations for these disappearances, and for a long time, they were the subject of various conspiracy theories among the Japanese public, some of which even outlandishly purported that North Korea was somehow behind all of them. Hardly anybody actually believed this until decades later in 2002, when Kim Jong-il confessed outright to the Japanese Prime Minister during a meeting that his country had indeed secretly abducted at least 13 Japanese citizens in the past and apologized for them. Since then, the Japanese government has formally recognized that at least 17 of their citizens were abducted by the North Koreans between 1977 and 1983, though independent investigations believe the true number is likely in the hundreds. These abductions were an organized program under the reign of Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current ruler Kim Jong-un, and the original founder of the Kim dynasty, who personally ruled for nearly 46 years across the second half of the 20th century. To this date, Kim Il-sung is still officially regarded by North Korea's legal system to be the country's eternal president. Even though he died decades ago in 1994, he is still heralded as nearly a god in the country, along with his son and grandson, who have both taken over the country's rule following him. Understanding him and how he molded North Korea into the bizarre necro-hereditary dictatorship it is today is a major lesson in what can happen with truly unchecked power in the modern world. Thank you for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments what surprised you the most in this video, or what you found the most fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Many more thrilling, shocking, and mind-blowing stories are coming soon.